For 8 years, the boy lived in silence. Doctors said it was permanent. His father spent millions trying to save him, but one maid noticed what every specialist missed, and everything changed. For 8 years, the boy never heard a single sound. Not his mother's voice, not laughter, not even his own cry. Doctors across the world examined him, elite specialists, advanced scans, treatments that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Every one of them said the same thing. There's nothing we can do. His father, a billionaire who could buy almost anything, refused to accept that answer. He flew across continents. He spent millions. He begged doctors and God for a miracle. What he didn't know was this: the miracle was never going to come from a hospital. It was coming from the woman he hired to clean his floors, a maid with no degree, no authority, and nothing to lose except her job, her freedom, and her future. What she discovered inside that child's ear would expose a truth no amount of money could hide, and it would change a family forever. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The Hart Mansion sat on 40 acres of land in Connecticut, surrounded by iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges that curved like they were afraid to grow out of line. From the outside, it looked like success, frozen in stone. Tall Georgian columns, polished marble steps, windows that caught the sunlight and reflected it back like glass mirrors. People driving past slowed down without realizing it. Some stared, some whispered, some imagined what kind of life must exist inside a place like that. None of them imagined silence, not the gentle, peaceful kind of silence that comes with rest. This was different. This silence had weight. Inside the mansion, sound was treated like a mistake. Doors were closed slowly. Footsteps were measured and soft. Even the air felt cautious, as if it had learned not to move too loudly. No music played in the hallways. No television murmured in the background. No laughter ever echoed off the walls. The staff learned quickly. Mr. Hart liked it quiet. Some said he couldn't stand noise. Others said noise reminded him of what he'd lost. Most evenings, Oliver Hart sat alone in his study on the west side of the mansion. The room was large, built to impress. Dark wood shelves climbed from floor to ceiling, filled with expensive books that had never been opened. Awards lined the walls, plaques, framed headlines, industry honors celebrating a man who had conquered markets, crushed competitors, and built an empire from vision and discipline. None of it mattered to him anymore. Oliver sat in a high-backed leather chair, facing the fireplace that rarely burned. His eyes stayed fixed on the painting above the mantel, his family. The painting was large, detailed, carefully commissioned by an artist who'd been flown in from Europe years ago. It showed them frozen in a moment that felt almost cruel. Now, Catherine stood in the center. Her smile was soft, natural, the kind of smile that made people feel safe just looking at it. Her eyes were alive, warm, intelligent, filled with quiet confidence. She wore a pale blue dress, Oliver remembered clearly. She'd teased him about it the morning of the sitting, saying it made her look too gentle for a world that rewards sharp elbows. Oliver had laughed and told her that gentleness was her strength. To her left stood Oliver himself, younger in the painting. His shoulders were relaxed. His eyes were full of plans instead of regret. This was a man who believed the world could be shaped with enough effort, and between them was Shaw, 3 years old in the painting, small hands clasped together, hair slightly unruly, eyes curious, unaware of what life was about to take from him. Oliver's gaze always returned to Catherine's face. She had died the day Shaw was born. Complications, the doctors had said. Too much bleeding, too little time. Oliver remembered the hospital room with brutal clarity, the smell of antiseptic, the harsh white lights, the sound of machines that beeped steadily until they didn't. He remembered standing at Catherine's side, holding her hand as it grew colder in his own. Her fingers had tightened once. Her lips moved. She was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Oliver never knew what she wanted to say, and that uncertainty haunted him more than anything else. "I'm sorry," he whispered now, the words barely disturbing the air. Sorry he hadn't chosen a different hospital. Sorry he hadn't demanded better care. Sorry he hadn't noticed the warning signs earlier. Guilt settled on his chest every night like a stone he could never lift. A soft movement caught his attention, a reflection in the glass of the study door. Oliver turned slightly and saw Shah standing in the hallway. 8 years old now, small for his age, shoulders often hunched as if he were trying to take up less space in the world. He held a toy airplane in one hand, the paint chipped from years of careful handling. His other hand drifted up toward his right ear, fingers brushing it briefly before falling back to his side. Oliver's chest tightened. Shah didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting to be noticed. Oliver rose from his chair and walked toward him. He knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Hey, champ," Oliver said softly, knowing his son couldn't hear him. Shah watched his lips carefully, as he always did. He studied his father's mouth, trying to piece together meaning from shapes and expressions. He smiled faintly, then lifted the airplane and pointed to it, flying. Oliver nodded and smiled back. He mimed the plane soaring upward, making exaggerated motions to make his son laugh. Shah's smile grew a little wider, but it never reached his eyes. The boy's hand drifted back to his ear, a quick touch, a slight wince. Oliver noticed it, but only as something familiar, something that had become part of his son's habits over the years. Doctors had said it meant nothing. Children develop tics, they'd explained. Nervous habits, nothing to worry about. Oliver trusted them. He always trusted people with degrees. Shah signed something simple, sleep, and pointed down the hallway. Oliver nodded again and gently kissed the top of his son's head. Shah leaned into the touch for just a second before pulling away and walking back toward the stairs, his footsteps light, almost careful. Oliver watched him disappear into the quiet. The silence rushed back in. Oliver returned to his chair, his gaze drifting once more to the painting. 8 years. 8 years of flying across continents. 8 years of hospital rooms and test results. 8 years of specialists shaking their heads. Johns Hopkins, Switzerland, Tokyo. Doctors who charged thousands per hour. Machines that hummed and beeped and produced images Oliver barely understood. Every single one of them had said the same thing. Congenital deafness. Irreversible. You need to accept this. Accept it. Oliver clenched his jaw. He could accept losses in business. He could accept setbacks. He could accept that some battles required patience. But this? How did a father accept that his child would live forever in silence? How did he accept that Shah would never hear his mother's name, never hear his father say, "I'm proud of you," never hear his own voice calling out into the world? Oliver leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere upstairs, Shah was settling into bed, pressing his ear against a pillow that offered no relief, no sound, no answers. And somewhere in that same house, unnoticed and unknown, a woman would soon walk through the front door, carrying nothing but quiet faith and desperate hope. Oliver didn't know it yet, but the silence that ruled his mansion was already cracking. Shah Hart had never heard a sound, not once in his 8 years of life. He didn't know what silence was, because silence was all he had ever known. To him, the world didn't feel quiet. It simply existed without noise, like a painting that never moved, like a movie playing behind glass. People assumed deafness was emptiness. They were wrong. Shah's world was full, just not in the way others understood. He woke each morning to light instead of sound, sunlight spilling through tall windows, was his alarm clock. Shadows shifting on the walls told him when the day had started. The rhythm of the house revealed itself through vibration, the faint tremor of footsteps through the floor, the subtle shake of doors opening and closing somewhere far away. He felt the world before he ever saw it. Shaw dressed carefully, always the same way, buttons aligned perfectly, shoes placed neatly by the bed. Order made the world feel safe. Disorder made it unpredictable. Downstairs, the mansion came alive in ways he sensed but never heard. Servants moved through hallways. Doors opened. Somewhere far away, machines hummed and stopped. But to Shaw, it was all movement without meaning. He often sat in the sunroom after breakfast, his favorite place in the house. Floor-to-ceiling windows let him watch the outside world, trees bending in the wind, birds lifting into the sky, cars passing beyond the gates. The birds fascinated him most. They opened their beaks wide, and something invisible seemed to come out. Other birds responded instantly. Shaw watched closely, studying the way heads tilted, wings fluttered, bodies reacted. Something is happening, he knew. Something I can't feel. That knowledge sat quietly inside him, like a question with no answer. Shaw had been tested more times than he could count. Hospitals frightened him. Bright lights, cold tables, strangers touching his head, inserting instruments into his ears. Doctors spoke to his father while Shaw watched their mouths move, watched their eyebrows lift and lower, watched the way their faces always ended the same way. Tight, apologetic, final. Sometimes they tried to make him respond to sounds, clapping behind his head, dropping objects on the floor, buzzing machines. Nothing. They wrote notes. They shook their heads. They patted Oliver's shoulder. Shaw learned early that doctors meant disappointment, so he learned to be still. Stillness made adults comfortable. At school, tutors came to the mansion, special instructors trained in sign language, patient but distant. They taught him the correct signs: father, house, eat, sleep. But Shaw invented his own signs too, signs for feelings adults didn't ask about. A tap to the chest meant happy. A finger tracing the air meant thinking. Both palms pressed together meant safe. He used that one rarely. Most people didn't make him feel safe. His father tried. Shaw loved Oliver fiercely, even when he felt invisible to him. Oliver was always there and never there at the same time. Present in body, absent in spirit. His eyes were often tired, distant, filled with thoughts Shaw couldn't reach. Sometimes Oliver spoke anyway. Shaw watched his lips carefully. "I'm sorry," his father often said. Shaw didn't know what those words meant, but he knew they were heavy. The one thing Shaw never understood was pain. Specifically, the pain in his right ear. It wasn't constant. It came and went, like something shifting inside him. Sometimes it felt like pressure. Other times it burned. Occasionally, sharp and sudden, it made him flinch. So he touched it. A habit born of confusion, not comfort. Doctors noticed, or maybe they noticed once, long ago, and then stopped. They said it was nothing. Nerves, sensitivity, psychological. Shaw accepted their explanations because he had no choice. But the pain kept coming. At night, he pressed his ear into his pillow, trying to dull the ache. During the day, he rubbed it absently while lining up his toys or watching birds outside the window. No one asked him why. No one really looked. Except once, years earlier, when his mother had still been alive. Catherine had noticed everything. She used to kneel in front of him, brushing his hair back gently, studying his face like it was a book written just for her. When he was a baby, she'd press her forehead to his and hum softly, feeling the vibration even though he couldn't hear it. She'd noticed him touching his ear once. She'd asked the nurse. The nurse said it was normal. Catherine wasn't convinced, but Catherine never got the chance to ask again. After she died, the house changed. and Shaw learned something without anyone teaching him. Pain was something you endured quietly. One afternoon, Oliver came home early from work. Shaw was in the sunroom, carefully assembling a model airplane piece by piece. His fingers were precise, patient. When a wing didn't fit, frustration flickered across his face. He pressed his lips together, breathed out slowly, tried again. Oliver watched from the doorway. For a moment, he just stood there. He saw his son's concentration, the small crease between his brows, the way his hand drifted briefly to his ear before returning to the airplane. Oliver felt a familiar ache in his chest. He stepped inside, knelt beside Shaw, and helped guide the wing into place. When it finally clicked, Shaw looked up, surprised, then smiled, a real smile. Oliver's heart swelled. He wished in that moment more than anything that Shaw could hear his voice. "I'm proud of you. You're doing great. I love you." Instead, Oliver smiled back and tapped Shaw's chest twice, the sign his son used for happiness. Shaw laughed silently, and for just a second, the silence didn't feel so heavy. But the pain returned later that evening. Shaw sat alone on the marble staircase, toy cars lined up perfectly beside him. His hand rose to his ear again, fingers pressing just a little harder this time. His face tightened. No sound escaped his mouth. No one noticed. No one except a woman quietly passing through the hallway. A woman who had just started working there, carrying a mop and a bag of cleaning supplies. Victoria Deer slowed her steps without realizing why. Her eyes landed on the boy, on his ear, on the pain written plainly across his face. Her heart whispered something urgent. "Look closer." Shaw didn't know it yet, but for the first time in his life, someone was about to see him, not as a case, not as a condition, but as a child in pain. And that single moment of attention would change everything. Victoria Deer arrived at the Hart estate on a Tuesday morning in October, under a sky so gray it felt like the world was holding its breath. She stood just outside the iron gates, gripping the strap of her worn canvas bag with both hands. Inside it were nothing but cleaning gloves, a small notebook, and a folded photograph she carried everywhere. Her grandmother sitting on the front steps of their old Newark apartment, smiling like the world had never been cruel to her. Victoria closed her eyes and took a slow breath. This has to work. Behind her, a bus pulled away, leaving silence in its wake. Ahead of her, the mansion rose from the land like something unreal, too large, too polished, too distant from the life she knew. She didn't come here chasing dreams. She came here running from fear. Back in Newark, her grandmother lay in a nursing home bed, frail and tired, her hands no longer strong enough to braid Victoria's hair like she used to. The bills had stacked up on Victoria's kitchen table like an accusation. 3 months overdue. The letter had been polite but firm. If payment is not received, alternative arrangements will be made. Victoria knew what that meant. State facilities, crowded rooms, people forgotten behind curtains. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Victoria was 11, fed her when money was tight, prayed over her when the world felt heavy, sat beside her bed during nights when grief felt unbearable. Victoria would not let her end her days alone and ignored. So when the agency called about a cleaning job at a private estate, long hours, strict rules, good pay, Victoria said yes before they finished explaining. The gates opened slowly. Victoria stepped inside. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, met her at the door. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and posture so straight it felt like a warning. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression suggested she had little patience for mistakes. "You're Victoria," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson looked her up and down, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "You'll clean floors, windows, linens. You'll stay on schedule and out of the way. Mr. Hart values order." Victoria nodded quickly. "I understand." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "There's one more rule," she said. "You do not get involved with the family, especially the boy." Victoria hesitated just long enough for it to be noticed. "Yes, ma'am," she said again. "The last girl thought she could help," Mrs. Patterson continued, "thought kindness would fix things. She was gone within a week." Victoria swallowed. "I'm just here to work." Mrs. Patterson studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring something unseen. "Good," she said finally. "Follow me." They walked through the mansion in silence. Victoria kept her eyes lowered, but she couldn't help noticing the details, the echo of her own footsteps, the way the air felt heavy and still, the absence of any sound that suggested life. No music, no voices, no warmth. It felt less like a home and more like a place frozen in grief. As they passed the grand staircase, Victoria saw him, the boy. He sat halfway up the steps, arranging small toy cars in a perfectly straight line. His movements were careful, deliberate, like he was trying to control a world that refused to make sense. He didn't look up when they passed, but his hand drifted to his right ear, just for a second. His fingers pressed lightly, then pulled away. His face tightened, a flash of pain so quick most people would miss it. Victoria didn't. Her chest tightened. She had seen that look before. Years ago, her cousin Marcus had worn the same expression, the same quiet confusion, the same unspoken question. Doctors had said Marcus was deaf, permanent, untreatable. 6 years later, someone finally looked closely. A blockage, one simple procedure, sound. Victoria's heart beat faster as the memory rushed back. She forced herself to keep walking. "It's not your place," she told herself. But something inside her whispered back, "Pay attention." Days passed. Victoria cleaned quietly, efficiently. Floors gleamed. Windows shone. Mrs. Patterson rarely corrected her, which felt like approval in that house. But Victoria watched. She watched the boy sit alone in sunlit rooms, surrounded by toys, but untouched by people. She watched the servants avoid him, not out of cruelty, but fear, as if his silence might be contagious. She watched his father pass through hallways without stopping, his face tired, his eyes elsewhere. And she watched the boy touch his ear, again and again. Each time, a small wince. Each time, no one noticed, except her. One afternoon, Victoria was dusting near the sunroom when she saw the boy struggling with a model airplane. His fingers fumbled with the wing, frustration tightening his face. Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't get involved." But before she could stop herself, Victoria knelt beside him. She took the wing gently and fitted it into place. Click. The boy looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then, the smallest smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Victoria's heart cracked open. She smiled back, slow and careful, and lifted her hand in a small wave. The boy hesitated, then waved back. That night, Victoria lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling. She thought about that wave. Such a small thing, but it felt like the beginning of something holy. The next morning, she folded a small paper bird from scrap paper she found in the kitchen and left it on the staircase, where the boy always sat. She didn't wait to see his reaction. The following day, the bird was gone. In its place was a small piece of paper. 2 shaky words, "Thank you." Victoria pressed the note to her chest, tears filling her eyes. She whispered into the quiet room, "Lord, let me help this child. Show me how." She didn't know it yet, but God was already answering, and the answer would ask more of her than she ever imagined. Victoria tried to convince herself it was nothing, a habit, a nervous tick, something harmless. That's what everyone else believed. But every morning, when she entered the mansion and began her work, her eyes searched for Shah before she even realized she was doing it. And every morning, she saw the same thing. The boy would sit alone, usually near a window where sunlight pooled on the floor. His toys were always arranged with careful symmetry. Airplanes lined nose to tail, puzzle pieces grouped by color, cars positioned as if waiting for instructions. and always, eventually, his hand would rise, 2 fingers brushing his right ear. A pause, a slight tightening of his jaw. Pain, not imagined, not exaggerated, real. Victoria noticed the pattern. It happened more often when the house was quiet, when Oliver was away, when the tutors had finished, when Shaw was left alone with his thoughts. It happened in the afternoons, after hours of stillness. It happened late in the evenings, when shadows stretched long and the boy pressed closer to the windows. No one else seemed to see it, or maybe they had seen it once and learned to ignore it. Victoria tried to do the same. She told herself she was overthinking. She reminded herself of Mrs. Patterson's warning. She reminded herself of her grandmother's bills waiting at home, of the paycheck she desperately needed. But something inside her refused to let it go. She began watching more carefully. One afternoon, while wiping down the banister near the staircase, Victoria noticed Shaw sitting halfway up the steps, his back pressed against the wall. He wasn't playing. He wasn't arranging toys. He was still. His eyes were closed. His hand pressed firmly against his ear now, not lightly like before. His brows were drawn together, lips pressed tight, his breathing shallow. Victoria's heart skipped. She slowed her movements, watching from the corner of her eye. Shaw rocked slightly, back and forth, as if trying to soothe himself. He opened his eyes and looked around, confused, then squeezed his eyes shut again. Pain was written plainly across his face. Victoria set down her cleaning cloth. Someone should help him, she thought. Someone should have helped him years ago. She stepped forward before fear could stop her. She knelt on the step below him, careful not to startle him. Slowly, gently, she raised her hand and pointed to her own ear, then to his. He watched her closely. She mimed a question. "Does it hurt?" Shaw hesitated. Then he nodded. Just once. Something in Victoria's chest broke. She signed as best she could. Not formal sign language, just instinct and empathy. "Can I look?" Fear flashed across his face. Hospitals lived in that fear. Doctors' hands, cold instruments. He shook his head quickly. Victoria nodded in understanding. She lowered her hand, letting him know she wouldn't force anything. She simply stayed there with him, silent, present. After a moment, Shaw relaxed slightly. That night, Victoria lay awake, replaying the image of his face. The pain wasn't random. It wasn't imagined. It was localized, specific. Her mind drifted back to Marcus. Doctors had called it congenital deafness, permanent, unfixable, until someone finally bothered to look properly. Victoria sat up in bed, heart pounding. What if? She shook her head. No, you're not a doctor. The next morning, she noticed something else. When Shaw touched his ear, there was sometimes a dark shadow just inside the canal, barely visible, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Victoria froze when she saw it. Her breath caught. She leaned slightly closer under the pretense of cleaning the nearby table. There it was, again. Something dark, dense, not natural. Her pulse quickened. How could doctors miss this? Or worse, what if they didn't? The thought made her stomach twist. Victoria backed away slowly, her hands shaking. She spent the rest of the day moving through her tasks like a ghost. Her thoughts raced. Every memory, every detail, every warning collided in her mind. Mrs. Patterson's voice echoed. You're here to clean, not to fix what can't be fixed. But what if it could be fixed? That evening, as Victoria cleaned the hallway outside Shaw's room, Mrs. Patterson appeared behind her. I've noticed you watching the boy, she said quietly. Victoria's stomach dropped. I just make sure I'm not in his way, she replied carefully. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, her voice low. You were warned. Mr. Hart does not want staff forming attachments, especially to Shaw. Victoria swallowed. He's in pain, she said before she could stop herself. Mrs. Patterson's eyes hardened. That is not your concern, she said sharply. Doctors have handled his condition. You are not here to question that. Doctors, the word echoed. Victoria nodded, biting her tongue. If Mr. Hart finds out you're interfering, Mrs. Patterson continued, you will be dismissed immediately. No reference, no explanation. She paused, letting the words sink in. Think carefully, she said, and walked away. Victoria stood there long after Mrs. Patterson was gone. Her hands trembled. She thought of her grandmother, of the nursing home bills, of the fragile stability this job provided. And then she thought of Shaw, small, silent, in pain, touching his ear while the world looked away. That night, Victoria sat on the edge of her bed with her Bible open in her lap. The words blurred. All she could think about was the dark shape inside a child's ear, and the feeling that God was asking her to see what others refused to. "Lord," she whispered into the quiet, "I don't know what to do." No answer came, only a deep, unsettling certainty. Something was wrong, and she was the only one who seemed willing to see it. Days passed in the Hart mansion, each one slower than the last, each one heavy with silence. Victoria worked quietly, cleaning floors and windows, moving through the house with the same care and attention as always. But her mind was elsewhere, tethered to the boy who had no voice, and the dark secret she suspected lived in his ear. Shaw noticed her, not in the way he noticed other people, not the distant acknowledgement he gave servants who brought him food or tidied his toys. He noticed her differently, her hands, her movements, the way her eyes lingered just long enough to watch him without judging, without speaking, without intruding. It was small at first, a glance, a nod, the barest acknowledgement that she existed in the world he controlled. Then came the signs. Not the formal signs the tutors had painstakingly taught him. Those were precise, mechanical, and often felt like a performance. No, these were his own creations, instinctive and personal. A tap to the chest meant he was happy. Pressing both palms together meant safe. Pointing to the sky meant he was thinking about stars. Victoria watched and mirrored him, carefully learning each movement. She responded not with spoken words. Those would mean nothing to him, but with gestures and signs of her own. Slowly, a dialogue began to form, invisible to the rest of the household. A folded scrap of paper became their messenger. She would leave small objects, a piece of candy wrapped in gold foil, a paper bird, a pencil with a broken tip, and he would leave something in return, a drawing of a plane, a line of cars in miniature, a symbol of his choosing. They laughed silently together, though laughter had no sound. It was in the tilt of a head, the flicker of a smile, the tap of fingers against a hand. Through these small exchanges, Victoria began to understand the boy's inner world. She saw the sharpness of his frustrations, the depths of his loneliness, the shadows of a pain that no doctor had addressed. And she saw the ear, always the ear, the small dark shadow inside the canal that no specialist had ever removed, the pain that came in waves, the silent cries that were never noticed. Victoria tried to ignore it, tried to focus only on the bond they were building. But every time Shaw pressed his hand to his ear, her stomach twisted. She would kneel beside him, mimicking his gestures, drawing out his own signs. "Safe," she would sign. He would nod. The word was sacred to them both, a reminder that for these few hours, at least, he could be free of pain. The connection grew deeper. It was not just empathy. It was understanding. It was recognition of suffering that no one else could see. One evening, Mrs. Patterson appeared again, her presence like a shadow across the hallway. "I've seen you with the boy," she said quietly, dangerously. Victoria froze, heart hammering. "I'm not causing trouble," she said. "I'm just keeping him company. He's lonely." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were sharp, cold. "Staff does not interfere," she said. "Mr. Hart does not allow it. You were warned." Victoria nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to overtake her. But inside, a storm was forming. She could not ignore what she saw. She could not stop watching. She could not let the boy suffer, not when the solution, she knew, was within reach. That night, she lay awake, fingers brushing the folded paper bird she had left on the staircase earlier. "Lord, give me courage," she whispered. "Give me wisdom. Show me what to do." She thought of her cousin Marcus, deaf for 6 years, written off by doctors, until someone finally looked. She thought of her grandmother, praying quietly in a room far away, relying on Victoria to survive. And she thought of Shaw, pressing his hands to his ear, living in a world no one else bothered to understand. Victoria realized that faith alone would not be enough. She would need action, and the action would demand everything she had. Because the next step, the step that might free Shaw from 8 years of silence, would require her to cross a line she had never thought she could cross. She did not know yet if she was ready, but she knew she could not stop. The secret language they had built was more than just communication. It was trust, and trust, once given, had to be honored. The days in the Hart mansion were long, heavy, and silent. But one evening, everything changed. Victoria had been watching Shaw all day, like she always did, keeping track of his routines, his gestures, his subtle movements that no one else noticed. She had seen it again, that shadow in his ear, small but distinct, dark and dense, pressing against his canal, the source of a pain that had defined the boy's entire life. Oliver was away on business. The mansion was quiet. Even the other servants moved with unusual care, as if they too were aware of the tension that hung in the air. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her mind. If I don't act, he suffers. If I act, I could lose everything. My job, my freedom, maybe even put myself in danger. She glanced at the hallway mirror, hands shaking slightly as she straightened her uniform. Lord, guide my hands. Give me the courage to do what must be done. She found Shah curled up on the marble floor near the sunroom, small body hunched, hands pressed tight against his right ear, his face twisted in silent agony, tears streaking his cheeks. Victoria dropped to her knees beside him. I'm here, baby, she signed gently, her hands trembling. I'm here. Shah looked at her, eyes wide, full of pain and fear. He flinched every time she moved closer, memories of hospitals and cold instruments flashing in his mind. Victoria took his small hands in hers. I would never hurt you, she signed. Never. He stared at her, unsure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he allowed her to touch his head, tilting it toward the morning light that streamed through the windows. There it was, clear now, dark, dense, pressing against his ear canal. Years of buildup, years of obstruction. Something so obvious yet unseen by every specialist, every doctor, every hand that had tried to help him. Victoria's breath caught. How could they all miss this? She thought of Marcus, her cousin, deaf for 6 years, until someone finally saw what no one else had. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a pair of sterilized tweezers she had prepared just in case. Her hands shook violently. Shah looked up at her, eyes wide with terror, but she whispered, I won't hurt you, I promise. He nodded slowly, a flicker of trust breaking through years of fear. Victoria held her breath. One hand steadied the boy, the other guided the tweezers. Slowly, carefully, gently, she hooked the dark mass, feeling its resistance. Her heart raced, every muscle trembling. One final pull. It came free. It landed in her palm, dark, wet, dense, the source of 8 years of silence. For a moment, there was nothing but disbelief. And then, Shah gasped. A real gasp, audible, clear. He clutched his ear, eyes wide, looking around at a world he had never heard. The clock on the wall ticked. Shah's eyes fixed on it. He whispered the word, unpracticed, trembling, broken, but unmistakable. Tick. Tears streamed down Victoria's face. Yes, baby, that's the clock. You can hear it. Shah's entire body trembled. He touched his throat, feeling the vibration of his own voice for the first time. Then came the word that would change everything. Dad. Oliver Hart's footsteps echoed in the hall, heavy and fast. He burst into the sunroom, white-faced, eyes wide, heart racing. What have you done? He shouted, seeing his son on the floor and the blood on Victoria's hands. Shah flinched at the volume, but spoke again, desperate and real. Dad, I can hear you. Oliver froze, unable to comprehend the sound. His legs buckled. His son's tiny hands reached up and touched his face. Your voice? Shah whispered. Tears ran down Oliver's face. Victoria extended her palm, showing the dark mass she had removed. This is what was in his ear. This is why he couldn't hear. Oliver's face turned pale. Anger, terror, disbelief, and then wonder all collided at once. You're not a doctor, he bellowed. You could have... Shah interrupted him, voice trembling but real. I can hear, Dad. I can hear. The sound shattered Oliver's fear, froze his anger, and replaced it with awe. For the first time in 8 years, Shah was part of the world he'd only ever watched. Victoria sank to the floor, exhausted and trembling, but she held her ground. She had acted on faith, and God had guided her hands. Oliver dropped to his knees beside his son, holding him tightly. I'm so sorry, he whispered, tears flowing freely. So sorry I didn't see it. So sorry I trusted the wrong people. Shah looked up at Victoria, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thank you, he said, voice broken but alive. And in that moment, the silence that had haunted the Hart mansion for 8 long years was finally broken. The miracle had come, not from wealth, not from specialists, but from a woman with nothing but faith, courage, and a willing heart. The mansion was no longer silent. It wasn't just Shah's voice breaking through 8 years of isolation. It was the weight of every missed moment, every ignored cry, every wasted procedure that now pressed on Oliver Hart's chest like a storm. Victoria sat on the edge of the hallway, hands still trembling, blood washed away, but adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Shah clung to his father, eyes wide, voice shaky, repeating words he had never spoken before. Dad, Dad, I can hear you. Oliver's knees buckled beneath him as he held his son, chest heaving, tears streaking down his face. 8 years of grief, guilt, and helplessness poured out in those moments. The money he had spent, the specialists he had trusted, the procedures that had failed to see the obvious, all of it meaningless against a child's silent suffering. And then his gaze shifted to Victoria, the woman who had risked everything, the woman who had acted when he had hesitated. His rage fought with his gratitude, fear collided with awe. "Victoria," he whispered, voice trembling. But before he could speak, 2 security guards appeared, alerted by the commotion. "Step aside," Oliver said, motioning them away. His hands still held Shaw's small body. "She did this." The guards froze, unsure. "She helped him," Oliver said again, voice louder, more certain. "She removed something the doctors left there for years. She gave my son his hearing back." The silence was heavy, almost unbearable. Shaw's small hands rested on his father's chest, eyes looking between the 3 adults in the room. Oliver finally stood, still holding his son, and walked toward Victoria. His eyes were red, filled with both grief and gratitude. "The doctors knew," he said softly. "They saw the blockage years ago and left him deaf." Victoria's breath caught. Oliver's voice broke. "All that money, all those specialists, they failed him. But you saved him. You saw him when no one else would." Victoria shook her head. I just couldn't let him suffer anymore. I couldn't ignore it. I had to try." Oliver dropped to his knees beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just try. You succeeded. You gave my son his life back." At the hospital, the doctors could barely believe what they were seeing. Shaw's scans were examined again and again, each one confirming what Victoria had already done. A dense obstruction had been lodged in his ear canal for years, overlooked and ignored. Dr. Matthews, one of the specialists Oliver had flown across the world to consult, looked guilty as he reviewed the records. "Mr. Hart," he said quietly, "the scans, they were noted, but follow-up procedures were never scheduled. We assumed the obstruction was minor. I don't know how this was missed." Oliver's face went pale. "Missed or ignored?" he whispered to himself. Victoria stood quietly beside them, hands folded, watching as Oliver processed the betrayal. 8 years of money, effort, and hope had been squandered by negligence and arrogance. Shaw, meanwhile, was exploring sound like a newborn discovering the world. The hum of fluorescent lights, the beeping of medical monitors, the chatter of nurses. Every sound was new, every word a wonder. "Music!" Shaw exclaimed, pointing to a nearby speaker. "I hear music." Victoria smiled, tears slipping down her face. Oliver turned to her, voice heavy with emotion. "I owe you everything. You didn't just act with courage, you acted with love." Victoria shook her head, overwhelmed. "I just did what I had to do. I couldn't let him suffer anymore." Shaw hugged her tightly, small arms around her waist. "Thank you," he whispered, voice rough but real. Oliver knelt beside them, tears streaming freely. "I trusted credentials. I trusted money. I trusted specialists. I threw everything I had at this problem, and it took a maid, a woman with nothing but a willing heart, to finally save my son." In that moment, the Hart Mansion was no longer just a house of silence. It was a home filled with sound, with hope, with gratitude, and with the recognition that sometimes miracles don't come through wealth or degrees. They come through the willing hands of someone who sees what everyone else has missed. The hospital room was alive with sound. For the first time in 8 long years, Shaw wasn't confined to silence. The hum of fluorescent lights, the gentle beeping of monitors, even the low murmur of nurses walking the halls. It was a symphony, a world he had only ever imagined. Every noise, every vibration felt like a gift he had been denied for far too long. Victoria sat beside him, holding his hand. Her heart was still racing from the events of the day, but she felt a profound peace. She had acted on faith, guided by a deep sense of purpose, and the result was undeniable. Shaw was finally free. Oliver Hart, still pale from shock and disbelief, paced the room. Each step was heavy with emotion, each breath a mix of relief and rage. He had confronted years of failure, negligence, and greed from the very people he had trusted to save his son. Dr. Matthews approached cautiously, papers in hand, voice trembling. "Mr. Hart, I don't know how to apologize. The blockage was documented years ago, but proper follow-up was never conducted. There is no excuse. We failed your son." Oliver's face hardened. "Failed? You left my son deaf on purpose." His voice shook with a mixture of fury and anguish. "You saw the problem and did nothing. Do you understand what 8 years of silence does to a child?" The doctor lowered his head. I cannot deny it. We overlooked it. We were negligent." Oliver turned to Victoria, eyes full of tears. "You saw what we could not. You acted when all of us, every specialist, every expert, had failed. You saved my son." Victoria shook her head, overwhelmed. "I just couldn't stand by and watch him suffer anymore. I did what anyone would do, anyone who could act." Shaw tugged at her sleeve, his small fingers tracing hers. You helped me, he whispered, voice raw but clear. I can hear because of you. Tears streamed down Victoria's face. You were always worth hearing, baby. Always. Oliver knelt beside them, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. I've spent a fortune chasing miracles, and I've realized money, degrees, fancy hospitals, none of it matters without a heart willing to see. Victoria smiled faintly, her faith affirmed, her courage validated. The doctors were summoned into Oliver's office later that afternoon. Legal and professional consequences were discussed. Oliver, fueled by the betrayal and gratitude alike, ensured that the negligence would not be repeated. Policies changed. Protocols tightened. The world that had failed Shaw was now accountable. Back in the mansion, the silence had lifted. Shaw laughed, experimenting with sounds, discovering the vibrations of his own voice, the rhythm of footsteps, the whir of the ceiling fan. Victoria watched him, quietly smiling. The boy she had nurtured in secret, through signs, paper birds, and small gestures of care, was finally living in the world he deserved. Oliver approached her one evening in the sunroom, watching Shaw arrange his toy airplanes in a line for the first time while listening to music through headphones. Victoria, he said softly, voice thick with emotion. You risked everything for my son. I can never repay you, but I want the world to know what you did. You have my gratitude and my respect. Victoria shook her head, humility in every movement. I didn't do it for recognition, sir. I did it because I had to, because God gave me a chance to help a child, and I couldn't say no. Oliver nodded, understanding. Sometimes miracles come in unexpected forms. Sometimes it's not the doctors or the money or the fame. Sometimes it's a willing heart, ready to act when no one else will. Shaw, noticing the quiet conversation, looked up at them. I can hear everything, he whispered, eyes wide with wonder. And I love you, Victoria. Her heart broke with emotion. And I love you too, baby, she said, holding him close. That night, Victoria sat by her grandmother's bedside on the phone, explaining everything, tears and laughter mingling in her voice. Her grandmother wept quietly, prayers of gratitude spilling through her lips. In the Hart mansion, Oliver held his son tightly, finally understanding the true meaning of love, loss, and the power of someone willing to see what others could not. Shaw's world was no longer silent, and in that sound, in that new-found life, everyone who had witnessed the miracle, the father, the son, and the maid who dared to act, discovered that faith, courage, and compassion could change the world, one heart at a time. Moral of the story: sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from money, fame, or expertise. They come from someone willing to see what others ignore, act when others hesitate, and care when others give up. Faith, courage, and a willing heart can move mountains and change lives in ways no one else can. Never underestimate the power of compassion, persistence, and paying attention to the small signs. Sometimes, the person who can make the biggest difference is the one the world overlooks. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button, subscribe to Momentum Stories, and share in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Remember, kindness and courage can create miracles in someone's life, maybe even yours.